The sun beat down mercilessly on the vast Wyoming Territory, scorching the earth and everything that dared to walk upon it. Zelda Norton stumbled across the barren landscape, her cracked lips bleeding, her vision blurring, and her heart pounding weakly in her chest like the last desperate beats of a dying animal. The year was 1878, and she was certain she would not live to see 1879. Her pale blue dress, once pristine, was now torn and stained with blood and dirt. Painful bruises flowered across her skin in various shades of purple and yellow, a garden of violence planted by her husband's fists. 3 days had passed since she'd fled from Thomas Norton's ranch in the dead of night, taking nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate prayer for survival. Another step, just one more. She repeated this to herself, a desperate mantra as the horizon wavered before her eyes. But her body had finally reached its limit. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed onto the unforgiving ground, dust rising around her like the last breath of her hope. As consciousness began to slip away, Zelda thought she heard the rhythmic pounding of hooves. A hallucination, surely a cruel trick played by her dying mind. The sound grew louder and a shadow fell across her face, blocking the punishing sun. Through half-closed eyes, she saw the silhouette of a man on horseback. "My God," a deep voice exclaimed. "Miss, can you hear me?" She tried to respond, but her parched throat produced only a weak moan. Strong arms gently lifted her from the ground, and she was vaguely aware of being placed on a horse, her body held securely against a solid chest. The scent of leather, tobacco, and pine filled her nostrils as darkness claimed her completely. Zelda drifted in and out of consciousness, catching fragments of reality like pieces of a broken mirror. Cool water on her lips, a soft bed beneath her aching body, a low, soothing voice. A cool cloth on her forehead. Each time she opened her eyes, a man with kind eyes and a weathered face was there, watching over her with concern. When she finally woke fully, sunlight was streaming through a small window, casting golden patterns on a simple wooden floor. She was in a modest cabin, lying on a bed covered with a patchwork quilt. Her dress had been replaced with a large cotton shirt that fell to her knees. "You're awake," said the same deep voice she'd heard before. Zelda turned her head to see a tall man standing in the doorway. He was handsome in a rugged way, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. His eyes were a startling shade of blue, like the sky after a summer storm. "Where am I?" she managed to whisper, her voice scratchy from disuse. "My ranch about 20 miles southeast of Laramie," he replied, approaching the bed with a cup of water. "Been taking care of you for near 3 days now. Name's Bryce Evans." Zelda tried to sit up but winced as pain shot through her ribs. Bryce quickly moved to assist her, his strong hands gentle as he helped her into a sitting position and offered her the water. "Slowly now," he cautioned as she drank greedily. When she had drained the cup, Zelda met his gaze. "Thank you, Mr. Evans," she said softly. I don't know how to repay your kindness." "No need for that," he replied with a small smile. "Couldn't very well leave you out there to die. Besides, Miss," she corrected quickly, then hesitated. "That is, my name is Zelda." She deliberately omitted her last name, not wanting any connection to Thomas. If Bryce noticed her reluctance to share her full name, he didn't comment on it. "Miss Zelda, then. You need rest, food, and time to heal. Nothing more to discuss until then." But there was much more to discuss, and they both knew it. The bruises on her body told a story that couldn't be ignored. The way she flinched when he moved too quickly spoke of a woman who had learned to fear men's hands. Yet he asked no questions, and for that, Zelda was grateful. In the days that followed, Bryce proved to be a respectful host. He slept in the small barn adjacent to the cabin, giving Zelda the privacy of the main house. Each morning, she awoke to find fresh water, food, and clean clothes laid out for her. Sometimes it was a simple dress that must have belonged to a previous occupant of the cabin. Other times, it was one of Bryce's own shirts, modified with a belt to fit her smaller frame. As her strength returned, Zelda began to venture out of bed. She found the cabin to be modest but well-maintained, a single room with a small kitchen area, a table with 2 chairs, and the bed she'd been occupying. Books lined a small shelf on one wall, surprising her with their variety, volumes of poetry, novels, and practical guides to ranching and medicine. On the fourth day, she felt strong enough to step outside. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by pines with a creek running nearby. Beyond the trees, she could see rolling pastures where cattle grazed. The air was sweet with the scent of wildflowers and pine, and for the first time in years, Zelda felt something akin to peace. She found Bryce by the corral, working with a young horse. He moved with a natural grace, his voice low and soothing as he guided the animal through its paces. He hadn't noticed her yet, and Zelda took the opportunity to observe him without being seen. He was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps 30 or so, with laugh lines around his eyes that spoke of a man who smiled often, despite the solitary life he seemed to lead. His hands, though calloused from work, were gentle with the horse, never forcing, only guiding. When he finally spotted her, his face broke into a wide smile that transformed his features. "Good to see you on your feet," he called, securing the horse before approaching. "How are you feeling?" "Better," she replied honestly. "Thank you for everything," he nodded, a slight flush coloring his cheeks. "Hungry. I was about to fix some lunch." Over a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee, they talked. Bryce told her about his ranch, modest by Wyoming standards, but all his own. He'd been there for 5 years, having come west from Pennsylvania after the war between the states. "Lost my pa in the fighting," he explained. "Ma followed a year later, pneumonia. Wasn't much left for me back east, so I decided to try my hand out here. Worked as a ranch hand for a few years, saved every penny, then bought this place." "It's beautiful," Zelda said sincerely. "It's a hard life, but honest," he replied. "What about you? If you don't mind my asking, what were you doing out there alone?" Zelda stared into her coffee cup, debating how much to share. This man had saved her life, cared for her, respected her boundaries. If anyone deserved the truth, it was him. "I was running away," she finally said, her voice barely audible, "from my husband." Bryce's expression darkened, his eyes flicking briefly to the fading bruises on her face and arms. "I figured as much," he said quietly. "Those marks weren't from a fall." "No," she agreed, "they weren't. You don't have to tell me anything more if you don't want to." But suddenly, Zelda found that she did want to. The story had been locked inside her for too long, a poisonous secret eating away at her soul. "I married Thomas Norton when I was 18, she began, her voice strengthening as she spoke. "He was much older, nearly 40, but charming and wealthy, the most eligible bachelor in our small Missouri town. My family was struggling after the war, and when he showed interest in me, they encouraged the match." She took a deep breath. "He was different after we married, controlling. Then angry, then violent. The first time he hit me was 6 months after our wedding. I'd spilled tea on one of his ledgers. He apologized afterward, promised it would never happen again." Bryce's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue. "But it did happen again, and again. Until it became so frequent that the days without pain were the exception, not the rule. 3 years of this, and I couldn't take it anymore. When he went on a business trip last week, I fled. I walked and walked, heading west because that was the opposite direction from where he'd gone." She laughed bitterly. "I had no plan, no supplies, just blind desperation. By the time you found me, I'd been walking for days without food or proper water. I thought I was going to die out there." "You nearly did," Bryce said softly, "if I hadn't been checking the far pasture that day." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her story hanging between them. "What will you do now?" Bryce finally asked. Zelda shook her head helplessly. "I don't know. I have no money, no skills except those of a housewife, and Thomas, he won't let me go easily. He sees me as his property, and he doesn't relinquish what belongs to him." "You don't belong to anyone," Bryce said firmly, a flash of anger in his eyes, "and you're welcome to stay here as long as you need to. I've got the barn, and you can have the cabin. Take time to heal, to think about your next steps." Gratitude welled in Zelda's chest, along with a wary hope she'd thought long extinguished. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" Bryce considered her question seriously. "My ma used to say that a person's character is shown by what they do when no one's watching. I couldn't live with myself if I turned away someone in need. He smiled slightly. Besides, you're not exactly a stranger anymore, are you? Over the next few weeks, Zelda regained her strength. Unable to remain idle, she took over the domestic duties of the small ranch, cooking, cleaning, mending Bryce's clothes. He protested at first, insisting she was a guest, not a servant, but Zelda was adamant. I need to be useful, she told him. And these are the things I know how to do. Gradually, a routine developed between them. Bryce would rise before dawn to tend to the cattle and horses, returning mid-morning for a breakfast Zelda had prepared. They would work separately during the day, he on the ranch, she in the cabin, and come together in the evenings for supper and conversation. Zelda found herself looking forward to these quiet evenings. Bryce was well-read and thoughtful, with a dry wit that often surprised laughter from her. He taught her to play checkers and was gracious when she began to beat him regularly. They talked about books, about the land, about everything except the shadow of Thomas Norton that hung over her future. As June turned to July, the heat intensified, and Zelda discovered a new freedom in the privacy of Bryce's land. She began to take daily swims in the creek, delighting in the cool water against her skin. One particularly scorching afternoon, she was so absorbed in the bliss of her swim that she didn't hear approaching footsteps until it was too late. "Oh," Bryce exclaimed, quickly turning his back when he realized she was in the water. "I'm sorry, I was just—" Zelda sank deeper into the water, her face burning with embarrassment. "It's my fault," she called. "I should have told you I'd be here." I'll go," he stammered, still facing away from her. "Wait," she said impulsively. "Could you? Would you leave the towel on that rock? I forgot to bring one." He nodded, placing the rough cloth on a flat stone near the bank before hastily retreating. When he was out of sight, Zelda emerged from the water, wrapping the towel around herself with shaking hands. The encounter left her oddly breathless, and not entirely from embarrassment. That evening, an awkward tension hung between them at supper. Bryce was more reserved than usual, and Zelda found herself struggling to maintain their normal conversation. It wasn't until they were washing the dishes together that he finally broke the silence. "I want to apologize again for this afternoon," he said, his eyes fixed on the plate he was drying. "I should have called out before approaching the creek." "There's no need to apologize," Zelda assured him. "This is your land after all." "But it's your privacy," he countered. "Which I respect." Zelda glanced up at him, noting the high color in his cheeks, the careful way he avoided looking directly at her. A realization dawned on her, both thrilling and terrifying. Bryce Evans was attracted to her. More surprising was her own reaction to this knowledge, a flutter in her stomach, a quickening of her pulse that had nothing to do with fear. For the first time since meeting him, Zelda allowed herself to see Bryce not just as her rescuer or a kind host, but as a man, a handsome, honorable man whose presence made her feel both safe and alive. The thought should have frightened her. After Thomas, she had sworn never to allow herself to be vulnerable to a man again. Yet with Bryce, vulnerability didn't feel like weakness, it felt like possibility. That night, alone in the cabin, Zelda examined her feelings with brutal honesty. Was she simply grateful to him for saving her life? Was she mistaking security for attraction? Or was this something more, something real and precious? She had no answers, only questions and a growing awareness that her time at the Evans Ranch was changing her in ways she hadn't anticipated. July gave way to August, bringing violent thunderstorms that rattled the cabin's windows and turned the dirt roads to mud. During one such storm, a particularly vicious lightning strike hit a tree near the barn, setting it ablaze. Bryce and Zelda worked side by side in the pouring rain, passing buckets of water to douse the flames before they could spread to the structure where the horses were housed. By the time they had extinguished the fire, they were both soaked to the skin and shivering. They ran to the cabin, laughing despite their exhaustion, exhilarated by their success and the wild energy of the storm. Inside, Bryce built up the fire while Zelda found dry clothes and blankets. They sat before the hearth, wrapped in quilts, their wet hair dripping onto their shoulders as they sipped hot coffee laced with a splash of whiskey. "You were incredible out there," Bryce said, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "Most women would have hidden in the house." "Most women haven't had to fight for their survival," Zelda replied, then softened her words with a smile. "Besides, I couldn't let your barn burn down after you've been kind enough to sleep there all these weeks." Bryce chuckled, then grew serious. "You know, there's something I've been meaning to ask you." Zelda tensed slightly, wary of what might come next. "Would you consider staying? Not just until you decide where to go next, but staying here permanently." Her heart skipped a beat. "What exactly are you asking, Bryce?" He set down his mug, turning to face her fully. "I'm asking if you'd consider making a life here with me." "As what?" she whispered, needing him to be explicit to leave no room for misinterpretation. "As my wife, if you'll have me," he said simply. "I know it's sudden, and given what you've been through, I'd understand if you never want to marry again. But I care for you, Zelda, more than I ever expected to care for anyone. And I promise you this, I will never, ever raise a hand to you in anger. I will never try to control you or break your spirit. I want a partner, not a possession." Tears filled Zelda's eyes, not of sorrow but of overwhelming emotion. A sharp knock at the door interrupted her response. They both froze, staring at each other in confusion. No one ever came to the Evans ranch, especially not in the middle of a storm at night. Bryce rose cautiously, gesturing for Zelda to stay where she was. He crossed to the door and opened it a crack, his body tense and ready for trouble. A man's voice came from outside, his words indistinct to Zelda but clearly audible to Bryce, whose shoulders stiffened. After a brief exchange, he closed the door and turned back to her, his face grave. "What is it?" she asked, dread pooling in her stomach. "A bounty hunter," Bryce replied grimly. "Looking for a runaway wife named Zelda Norton, says her husband's offering a substantial reward for her return." The blood drained from Zelda's face. "He found me," she whispered. "I sent him on his way," Bryce assured her quickly. "Told him I hadn't seen anyone matching your description." "But Zelda, he won't be the last. If your husband's hired bounty hunters, he's serious about finding you." "I have to leave," she said, rising unsteadily to her feet. "I can't bring this trouble to your door." "If Thomas discovers you've been harboring me, you're not going anywhere," Bryce said firmly. "Not alone, at least. What choice do I have? As long as I'm Thomas's wife, I'll never be free. He'll never stop looking for me." Bryce was quiet for a moment, thinking. "What if you weren't his wife anymore? Divorce is nearly impossible to obtain, especially for a woman," Zelda said bitterly. "And even if I could, Thomas would never agree to it." "I wasn't thinking of divorce," Bryce said slowly. "I was thinking of widowhood." Zelda stared at him in shock. "What are you suggesting?" "Not murder," he clarified quickly. "But what if Thomas Norton were to believe you died? If there was evidence convincing enough that he stopped looking for you, how would we manage that?" "I have an idea," Bryce said, beginning to pace the small cabin. "But it would mean you'd have to leave your old identity behind completely. You'd be starting over with nothing but a new name." "I already left everything behind when I ran," Zelda pointed out. "There's nothing of my old life I wish to keep except my freedom." They stayed up late into the night, refining Bryce's plan. By morning, when the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and glistening, they had a strategy that might just work. "Are you certain about this?" Zelda asked as Bryce prepared to ride into town. "It's not too late to change your mind." He took her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "I've never been more certain of anything, but you never answered my question from last night before we were interrupted." Zelda's heart swelled with emotion. Against all odds, in the midst of danger and uncertainty, she had found something precious and rare. A man whose strength came from kindness, not cruelty, whose protection offered freedom, not confinement. "Ask me again when this is over," she said softly, "when I'm truly free to answer." Bryce nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'll be back by nightfall," he promised, and then he was gone, his horse kicking up mud as they galloped down the path toward Laramie. Alone at the ranch, Zelda prepared for her own role in their scheme. She gathered supplies, wrote letters according to Bryce's instructions, and tried not to think about all the ways their plan could go wrong. True to his word, Bryce returned as the sun was setting. His expression was grim but determined as he dismounted and entered the cabin. "It's done," he said. "I spoke with the sheriff, told him I found a woman's body in the river downstream from my property. Badly decomposed, but wearing this." He held up a torn piece of blue fabric, a scrap from the dress Zelda had been wearing when he found her. She had kept it, unable to part with her last link to her former life, though it held only painful memories. "The sheriff seemed to accept your story," she asked anxiously. Bryce nodded. "He's sending a telegram to Missouri tomorrow, asking for confirmation about a missing woman named Zelda Norton. Once your husband responds, they'll likely declare you dead, a tragic victim of exposure and the river. And if they want to see the body," I told them I buried her already, out of respect. "There's a fresh grave on the edge of my property with a wooden cross bearing the name Unknown Woman." The sheriff wasn't happy about it, but he understood. Folk die out here all the time without proper burials. Zelda exhaled slowly, hope and fear warring within her. "So now we wait." "Now we wait," Bryce agreed, "but not here. It's too risky to keep you at the ranch while this plays out. I've made arrangements for you to stay with friends of mine, a Cheyenne family that lives beyond the reservation boundaries. They owe me a favor, and they'll keep you safe until we know for certain that Thomas has accepted your death." The separation was necessary, but painful. Zelda had grown accustomed to Bryce's presence, to their shared meals and conversations, to the quiet understanding that had developed between them. The prospect of weeks apart, with only uncertainty ahead, left her with a hollow ache in her chest. The following morning, before dawn, Bryce escorted her to the Cheyenne camp, introducing her to Running Deer and his wife, Morning Sky. They welcomed Zelda warmly, assuring Bryce that she would be protected as one of their own for as long as necessary. "I'll come for you when it's safe," Bryce promised as they said goodbye. "Whatever happens, know that I meant what I said. My feelings haven't changed." "Nor have mine," Zelda replied, finally allowing herself to acknowledge the truth. "Be careful, Bryce. Thomas is a dangerous man." "So am I when protecting what matters to me," he said with a gentle smile. Then he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Zelda to begin her temporary life among the Cheyenne. The weeks that followed were a strange mixture of peace and anxiety. Morning Sky took Zelda under her wing, teaching her the ways of their people, how to prepare traditional foods, how to craft useful items from natural materials, how to move silently through the forest. Running Deer's teenage sons taught her to ride properly and to track game, skills she'd never had the opportunity to learn before. The simplicity of life in the camp was healing for Zelda. There were no pretenses here, no rigid social expectations like those that had governed her life in Missouri. People worked hard but took pleasure in their tasks. Children played freely, their laughter a constant backdrop to daily activities. And no one raised a hand in violence against their spouse or children, a stark contrast to the world Zelda had known, yet always her thoughts returned to Bryce. Had their plan succeeded? Was Thomas convinced of her death? And was Bryce safe from his vengeance if he suspected deception? Nearly a month passed before a rider approached the camp. Zelda was helping Morning Sky prepare the evening meal when Running Deer called out a greeting. She looked up to see Bryce dismounting from his horse, his face weary but brightening when he caught sight of her. Morning Sky nudged her with a knowing smile. "Go to him," she said. "Your man has returned for you." Zelda needed no further encouragement. She ran to Bryce, stopping just short of embracing him, suddenly uncertain despite the warmth in his eyes. "Is it done?" she asked breathlessly. "Am I free?" "It's done," he confirmed. "Thomas Norton received word of your death 3 weeks ago. He sent a representative to claim your body, but when told there was none to claim, he authorized a small payment for a proper headstone for the empty grave. According to my sources in town, he's already courting a new wife back in Missouri." Relief washed over Zelda in a dizzying wave. "So I'm dead to the world," she murmured. "Zelda Norton exists no more." "But you still exist," Bryce said, taking her hands in his. "You can be whoever you want to be now." She looked up at him, at this man who had saved her in every possible way and knew exactly who she wanted to be. "I want to be yours," she said simply, "if your offer still stands." Joy transformed his features, erasing the weariness from his journey. "It stands," he assured her. "It will always stand." That evening, they shared the news of their engagement with Running Deer and his family, who insisted on hosting a celebration. Under a canopy of stars, with the beat of drums and the glow of firelight, Zelda danced for the first time in years, her spirit lighter than she could ever remember. Later, as they sat apart from the others, watching the embers of the fire burn low, Bryce asked, "What will your name be now? You can't be Zelda Norton anymore." She considered the question carefully. A new name meant a new beginning, a chance to define herself on her own terms. "Zelda Evans," she said with quiet certainty. "If you'll have me." "I will," he promised, sealing the vow with a kiss that spoke of all the tomorrows stretching before them, tomorrows filled not with fear but with hope. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Laramie. Running Deer and his family attended, along with a few of Bryce's ranching friends. No one questioned the bride's background or lack of family. The West was full of people reinventing themselves, leaving troubled pasts behind in search of better futures. Zelda wore a dress of creamy white cotton, adorned with delicate embroidery created by Morning Sky's skilled hands. As she spoke her vows, looking into Bryce's clear blue eyes, she felt the last shadows of Thomas Norton's cruelty receding, replaced by the warm light of new beginnings. Their return to the Evans ranch marked the true start of their life together. Zelda crossed the threshold of the cabin not as a guest or a fugitive, but as Bryce's wife and equal partner. The small space that had once been her refuge now became their home, filled with shared dreams and quiet moments of joy. Autumn came to Wyoming, painting the landscape in golds and crimsons. The days grew shorter, the nights cooler, and Bryce and Zelda settled into the rhythms of married life with a contentment neither had dared to imagine possible. They worked side by side to prepare the ranch for winter, harvesting the small garden Zelda had planted, repairing the barn and cabin to withstand the coming snows, smoking meat and preserving fruits to see them through the cold months. In the evenings, they planned for the future. Additions to the cabin, improvements to the ranch, perhaps children someday when they were ready. On the first anniversary of the day Bryce had found her collapsed in the wilderness, Zelda woke before dawn. She slipped from their bed without waking him and went outside to watch the sunrise. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of winter's approach. As the first golden rays broke over the horizon, she reflected on all that had changed in a single year. She had gone from a battered, desperate woman with no hope to a beloved wife with a future full of possibilities. The bruises on her body had long since faded, and though the memories of Thomas's cruelty would never completely disappear, they no longer held power over her. She heard the cabin door open behind her and smiled as Bryce's strong arms encircled her waist, his chest warm against her back. "Happy anniversary," he murmured against her hair. "1 year since I found the greatest treasure of my life." Zelda leaned into his embrace, savoring the security and tenderness she had once thought beyond her reach. "I was thinking about that day," she said, "how close I came to death. I thank God every day that I rode out to check that pasture," Bryce said, "that I found you in time." She turned in his arms to face him, placing a hand against his cheek. "You did more than save my life, Bryce Evans. You showed me what love should be, not possession or control, but partnership and respect." "You saved me too," he countered. "I was lonely here, going through the motions of living without really being alive. You changed that." They stood together, watching as the sun climbed higher, bathing the land in its golden light. Neither spoke for a long moment, content in the silence and each other's company. Finally, Zelda said, "I have something to tell you, a gift of sorts, though it won't arrive for some months yet." Bryce looked at her quizzically, then his eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Are you?" She nodded, joy bubbling up inside her. "Come spring, there will be 3 of us on the Evans ranch." His whoop of delight echoed across the valley as he lifted her in his arms and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, his expression was one of wonder and fierce love. "I promise you this, Zelda Evans," he said solemnly. "Our child will know only kindness and love. The cycle of cruelty ends with us." "I know," she replied, standing on tiptoe to kiss him. "That's why I'm not afraid, not of motherhood, not of the future. With you, I've learned to hope again." As winter descended on Wyoming, bringing howling blizzards and crystalline beauty, Bryce and Zelda found warmth in their small cabin and in each other's arms. They read aloud from Bryce's collection of books, played countless games of checkers, and talked for hours about the life they would build together. Zelda's body changed with the passing months, her belly rounding with new life. Bryce treated her with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes, his hands gentle as they traced the curve that held their child. On nights when the baby's movements kept her awake, he would tell stories to both of them, tales of his childhood in Pennsylvania, adventures from his early days in the West, and dreams for their future together. Spring arrived in a rush of melting snow and new growth. As the land awakened from its winter slumber, Zelda's time drew near. Bryce had arranged for the local midwife to stay with them during the final week of her confinement, a no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Holbrook, who had delivered half the children in the county. "You've got good hips for birthing," the midwife declared upon meeting Zelda, "and a strong constitution. Despite what you've been through, you'll do fine." When labor began on a bright May morning, Zelda faced it with the same determination that had carried her through her escape from Thomas. The pain was intense but purposeful, bringing her closer with each contraction to meeting the child she already loved beyond measure. Bryce remained by her side throughout, wiping her brow, holding her hands, and murmuring encouragement when her strength faltered. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, their daughter entered the world with a robust cry that spoke of healthy lungs and a fighting spirit. "She's perfect," Mrs. Holbrook announced, placing the swaddled infant in Zelda's arms. "A fine, strong girl." Tears streamed down Zelda's face as she gazed at the tiny features, the button nose, the rosebud mouth, the wispy dark hair that promised to be as rich and curly as her father's. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you." Bryce sat beside them on the bed, one arm around Zelda's shoulders, his free hand gently touching their daughter's cheek. "What shall we name her?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Zelda considered for a moment. "Hope," she decided, "because that's what she represents for us both." "Hope Evans," Bryce tested the name, then nodded in approval. "It suits her." Mrs. Holbrook left the next morning, satisfied that mother and child were doing well. The little family settled into a new rhythm, their days and nights now governed by Hope's needs. Zelda discovered a wellspring of patience and love within herself as she cared for her daughter, while Bryce took on additional ranch duties to allow her time to recover and bond with the baby. Summer bloomed across the land, bringing lush green grass for the cattle and wild roses that climbed the fence posts around the cabin. Zelda began taking Hope outside for short periods each day, wanting her daughter to know the beauty of the world from her earliest moments. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Hope asleep in a cradle Bryce had crafted, he turned to Zelda with an expression of quiet contentment. "I've been thinking," he said. "This cabin's getting a bit small for the three of us. I'd like to build a proper house, something with room to grow." Zelda smiled, understanding the implication. "Planning for more children, Mr. Evans?" "If you're willing, Mrs. Evans," he replied with a grin. "I was thinking 3 or 4 would be a good number." She laughed softly, careful not to wake Hope. "Let's start with the house and see where life takes us. But yes, I'd like that too." Bryce reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "When I found you that day, I never imagined we'd be sitting here now with a daughter and plans for a bigger house. It feels like a dream sometimes." "Not a dream," Zelda said, squeezing his hand. "A second chance for both of us." As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the Wyoming sky, they remained on the porch, talking quietly about their plans for the future, the house they would build, the ranch they would expand, the family they would nurture. For Zelda, who had once known only fear and pain in marriage, these simple domestic dreams were the greatest treasure of all. 5 years passed, bringing changes both expected and surprising to the Evans ranch. The small cabin was replaced by a proper 2-story home with ample room for their growing family. Hope, now a spirited 5-year-old with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determination, was joined by 3-year-old Benjamin and infant twins Sarah and Samuel. The ranch had prospered as well, with additional acres purchased and a reputation for quality stock that brought buyers from as far as Denver. Bryce had hired 2 full-time ranch hands to help with the expanding operation, while Zelda managed the household and children with calm efficiency. On a bright autumn day, much like the one when Bryce had first found her, Zelda sat at her new writing desk, penning a letter to Morning Sky. The Cheyenne woman and her family had remained close friends over the years, visiting regularly and maintaining a bond that transcended cultural differences. A commotion outside drew Zelda's attention. She rose from her desk and moved to the window, expecting to see the children playing or perhaps the ranch hands returning with the cattle. Instead, she saw a dusty carriage approaching along the main road, an unusual sight at their remote location. Curious, she stepped onto the porch, shading her eyes against the sun to better see the unexpected visitors. Bryce appeared from the direction of the barn, clearly also intrigued by the arrival. As the carriage drew nearer, Zelda felt an inexplicable chill run through her. Something about the way the passenger sat, rigid and proper despite the rough road, triggered a memory she had long suppressed. When the vehicle stopped in the yard, the door opened to reveal a man in his 50s, gray-haired and impeccably dressed despite the dust of travel. He surveyed the property with a critical eye before his gaze landed on Zelda, and then he froze, his face draining of color as though he had seen a ghost. In that moment, Zelda recognized him. Thomas Norton, the husband she had fled from, the man who believed her dead these past 6 years. Fear gripped her heart with icy fingers. How had he found her? What did he want? And most terrifying of all, would he try to reclaim her as his wife? Bryce sensed her distress and moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "Can I help you, sir?" He called to the visitor, his voice pleasant but carrying an undertone of wariness. Thomas seemed unable to speak, his eyes fixed on Zelda with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Finally, he managed, "It cannot be. They told me you were dead." Bryce's arm slipped around Zelda's waist, steadying her. "I believe you're mistaken, sir. This is my wife, Zelda Evans." "No," Thomas said sharply. "That is Zelda Norton, my wife, who supposedly drowned 6 years ago." The moment of truth had arrived, unavoidable and terrifying. Zelda straightened her spine, drawing strength from Bryce's support and from the life they had built together. "I was Zelda Norton once," she acknowledged, her voice surprisingly steady, "but that woman did die in the river. I am Zelda Evans now, mother of 4 children and wife to a good and honorable man." Thomas's face darkened with anger. "You deceived me. Let the world believe you dead while you played house with this cowboy." "I did what was necessary to survive," Zelda replied without apology. "You nearly killed me, Thomas, if not with your fists, then with the fear and despair that drove me to flee into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on my back." Her former husband seemed taken aback by her directness, clearly unused to the woman before him who spoke her mind without fear. "You were my wife," he said, as if that explained and excused everything. "You had duties, obligations, she owed you nothing," Bryce interrupted, his voice hard with controlled anger. "Not after what you did to her." Thomas glared at him. "This doesn't concern you." "She is legally my wife, and I've come to reclaim what's mine." "That's where you're wrong," Zelda said calmly. "In the eyes of the law, Zelda Norton died 6 years ago. You acknowledged her death, even paid for a headstone. I am Zelda Evans, and I have been for the past 6 years with a marriage certificate and 4 children to prove it." Uncertainty flickered across Thomas's face, but he rallied quickly. "Fraud is still fraud. When I inform the authorities, you'll do what exactly?" Bryce challenged. Admit that you beat your wife so severely that she preferred risking death in the wilderness to remaining with you. Explain the bruises that covered her body when I found her. Because that's what any investigation would reveal, Mr. Norton. Before Thomas could respond, the front door opened and Hope peeked out. Mama, Benjamin's crying because he can't find his wooden horse. Zelda turned to her daughter with a forced smile. I'll be right there, sweetheart. Go back inside now. The child obediently retreated, but not before Thomas had seen the clear resemblance to both Bryce and Zelda in her features. Something in his expression changed, a flicker of realization that what he sought to reclaim no longer existed. You have children, he said flatly. I do, Zelda confirmed. 4 beautiful children who have never known a harsh word or a raised hand from their father, children who are growing up surrounded by love and respect. Thomas stared at her for a long moment, then at the prosperous ranch around them, the solid house that spoke of permanence and success. When he spoke again, his voice carried a bitterness that seemed to have aged with him. I searched for you, he said. When they told me you were dead, I didn't believe it at first. There was no body, just a scrap of your dress and a story about a woman found in the river. I hired investigators, offered rewards, but eventually I accepted it, mourned you even in my way. And found yourself another wife, Zelda noted. She had heard through distant connections that Thomas had remarried less than a year after her death. He waved a dismissive hand. Catherine, yes, not the same as you, but obedient enough. The casual cruelty in those words reinforced for Zelda how right she had been to flee, how fortunate she was to have found Bryce. What do you want, Thomas? Why have you come here after all this time? He seemed to deflate slightly, the righteous anger that had propelled him giving way to something closer to resignation. I came to Wyoming on business, a potential investment in a silver mine. While in Laramie, I heard talk of a rancher named Evans with a wife whose description matched yours too closely to be coincidence. I had to see for myself. And now that you have, Bryce asked, still protective at Zelda's side. Thomas looked between them, then at the house where children's voices could be faintly heard. Now I see that Zelda Norton truly did die in that river, he said finally. The woman standing before me is someone else entirely, someone I never knew. Relief washed through Zelda, tempered with caution. Does that mean you'll leave us in peace? What choice do I have? Thomas replied with a bitter laugh. To pursue this would bring scandal I can ill afford, and for what? To claim a wife who clearly despises me, who has built a life and family with another man, even I am not that much of a fool. He turned back toward his carriage, then paused. One thing before I go, were you ever happy with me, Zelda? Even in the beginning, the question caught her off guard with its vulnerability. She considered lying, giving him the comfort of a false memory, but found she couldn't. No, Thomas. I was never happy. I was young and afraid and doing what my family expected of me. I didn't know what happiness could be until I found it here. He nodded once, accepting her truth with surprising dignity. Then I wish you well with it, he said, and climbed into his carriage. As they watched him drive away, Zelda leaned into Bryce's embrace, her heart pounding with the aftermath of confrontation and relief. Do you think he'll keep his word? Leave us be? I believe he will, Bryce replied. He's a proud man, and to pursue this would mean admitting his failures as a husband. Besides, he smiled down at her. He saw what I knew from the moment I found you, that you're a woman worth loving properly, worth respecting. Perhaps he finally understands what he lost through his cruelty. Zelda turned to face the house, their home filled with the sounds of their children playing. Then it's truly over, she said, wonder in her voice. I'm free of him once and for all. You've been free since the day you found the courage to run, Bryce reminded her, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Everything else has just been the world catching up to that truth. That evening, with the children bathed and tucked into bed, Zelda and Bryce sat together on the porch swing, watching as stars appeared in the darkening sky. The encounter with Thomas, rather than casting a shadow over their happiness, had somehow made it more precious, more real. I've been thinking, Bryce said, his arm comfortably around her shoulders. Hope will be ready for proper schooling soon. Perhaps it's time we considered building that school we've talked about, something for all the ranch children in the area. Zelda smiled, loving how his mind always moved forward, planning for their future. I could teach, she suggested. I've always enjoyed working with Hope on her letters and numbers. You'd be wonderful at it, he agreed. And it would give those children, especially the girls, a chance to see a strong, educated woman as their teacher, a woman who overcame hardship to build a beautiful life. Is that how you see me? She asked, touched by his perception. That and so much more, Bryce assured her. I see the frightened woman I found in the wilderness, yes. But more importantly, I see the brave woman who survived, who healed, who allowed herself to love again despite every reason to be wary. I see the mother of my children, the partner in all my dreams, the love of my life. Zelda rested her head against his shoulder, contentment flowing through her like a warm current. When I collapsed that day, I thought I was dying, she reflected. Instead, I was being born into a new life, one I couldn't have imagined in my darkest moments. And I thank God every day that I was the one who found you, Bryce said softly. As night fell completely, wrapping the Evans ranch in its velvet darkness, Zelda thought about the long, winding path that had brought her here, the pain and fear that had driven her into the wilderness, the near death that had led to her rescue, and the love that had given her a second chance at life. She had once been a woman collapsed from heat and hunger, her husband's bruises fresh on her skin. Now she was Zelda Evans, beloved wife, mother of 4, respected in her community, and mistress of a prosperous ranch. The transformation seemed almost too profound to be real, yet here she was, solid and warm in her husband's arms, their children sleeping peacefully inside the home they had built together. I love you, Bryce Evans, she whispered into the quiet night. For saving me, for loving me, for giving me this life. I love you too, he replied, his voice carrying all the tenderness that had healed her wounded heart. But you saved yourself, Zelda. I just had the good fortune to be there when you did. The porch swing creaked gently as they rocked in comfortable silence, the stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and joys, children to raise, a ranch to run, perhaps a school to build. But for now, this moment was enough, this peace, this certainty, this love that had been forged in the harshest of circumstances and emerged unbreakable. From the ashes of Zelda Norton's desperate flight had risen Zelda Evans's triumphant life, proof that even in the wild, unforgiving landscape of the West, a second chance was possible for those brave enough to seize it.